All right, we are ready to get started here, and it is 10 o'clock, so I anticipate, based on our RSVPs, that we may have some more people walking in, but out of respect for those of you who are on time, I want to go ahead and get started. So, welcome. I am Kimberly Bouchard, and I am very excited that we have this new dedicated funding stream for youth diversion. And I'm so happy that you were able to, pardon me, to be here today and join us for this bidders conference for the Youth Reinvestment Grant. We are also live streaming this meeting, so we have people who are joining us online, and I would ask those folks at this time to, if you would, use the chat function and let us know how the audio and video quality is for you. So the purpose of this bidders conference is to clarify the RFP instructions and to answer technical questions. So in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to do some introductions, and then I'll provide a high-level summary of the grant, talk a little bit about the Executive Steering Committee that helped us develop the request for proposals, provide an overview of the RFP as well as the proposal rating process and some proposal instructions. We'll go over some key dates, and then the last item on this slide, I also want to talk a little bit up front about questions and how we're going to handle questions today. So I do want to try to maintain some fluidity in my presentation, our presentation. So I would ask that you hold your questions, and periodically I'll pause and ask for questions. And at that time, for those of you who are in the room, if you would please come up to our podium and make sure that you use the microphone so that we can all hear you in this room and also have the live stream folks hear you as well. And then for those on the live stream, if you would please use the chat function and type your question in there, we'll read it out here and respond to it. Okay, so then starting with introductions, again, my name is Kimberly Bouchard. I am the field representative here at the BSCC who's responsible for the Youth Reinvestment Grant, and I am working in the Corrections Program and Grants Planning Division. And I will ask my colleagues to introduce themselves as well.
Tony Jackson, and I'm working in the Research Unit Division.
Hi, I'm Isabel Diaz. I'm an analyst here at the BSCC.
Hi, I'm Helene Zettner. I'm a field representative with the CPGP division of the BSCC.
Hi, my name's Kat. I'm from IT.
My name is Sean. I'm from IT.
Okay, great. And since we do have a reasonable number of folks here, I would like to ask you, if you don't mind, to please stand up and provide just your name and your organization name. Welcome. Great, thank you. Thanks. All right, welcome. Thank you. Hi, Matt. Great, welcome. Hello. Okay, very good. And then for the folks that are on the live stream, I would ask that you please use the chat function and just tell us who you are as well, so that we'll have that going forward. And those of you in the room, I appreciate you standing up and sharing who you are. If you didn't already, I would ask that you also take a minute to sign our sign-in sheet on the back table there. Okay, so then looking back at the PowerPoint, we're going to go right into the grant summary. And the Youth Reinvestment Grant was established during the budget process last summer. It provides a little over $35 million for California cities and counties to provide diversion programs for minors. The legislation does specify that these diversion programs must be trauma-informed, evidence-based, culturally relevant, and developmentally appropriate. Sorry about that. All right. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to talk about right up front this morning is the structure of this grant, because I know there have been a lot of questions in the field about this. And in fact, it is a bit of a unique structure that we have for this Youth Reinvestment Grant. So what we see with this one is there's really 3 different entity types that are involved in each grant. There's the applicants, which in this case, only California cities and counties are eligible to apply for these grant funds. But then there is also the responsibility for the applicant to identify a lead public agency who will coordinate the implementation of the grant locally. And then there also has to be 1 or more non-governmental organizations who are identified to actually provide the diversion services. So looking a little bit more closely at what we mean when we talk about the eligible applicants being cities and counties. For California counties who want to apply for these funding, the applications must be submitted by the Board of Supervisors or the Chief County Administrative Officer. Similarly, for California cities that wish to apply, applications must be submitted by the City Council or the administrative office of the city. And then again, just looking a little more at this, the other 2 players here, the lead public agency then would be appointed by the city or county applicant. And it's allowable under this grant for the city or county to decide to serve in that lead public agency role itself. And that may happen, but what we really anticipate seeing more of is that the city or county would appoint a department or agency under it to serve as the lead public agency. And then the non-governmental organizations that are a part of these grants, it's possible that an applicant could use only 1 NGO for the purposes of providing diversion services. But it's also possible that more than 1 would be required, and any number of NGOs could be involved in each proposal. Okay, so looking at the Executive Steering Committee, this is a process that the BSCC routinely uses in order to do our grant development work. And in this case, the Executive Steering Committee that was appointed to work on the Youth Reinvestment Grant had 14 members representing various disciplines and communities throughout California. As is always the case, we have a chair for the ESC that comes from our BSCC board. And in this case, we had co-chairs, and they were BSCC board members David Steinhardt and Mark Varela. The full roster for the ESC that was used for this grant is included in the RFP and can be found at page 36. So then looking at what the role of this ESC is, the first thing that they took on was the task of going through a series of meetings and talking about the statute that enabled this grant funding and working from there to develop the criteria that created this request for proposals. The next thing that they'll be responsible for is reading and rating the proposals that are submitted in response to the RFP. And then finally, the ESC is ultimately responsible for developing the award recommendations that will go before our board for consideration and approval. So given the work that the ESC members do in terms of grant development, creating the request for proposals, and then of course developing recommendations for who will actually be funded, we do have conflict of interest policies that prohibit anyone who participated on the ESC from receiving these grant funds. And that is the individual themselves and also their organization, and that carries through the life of the grant. Okay, so with the next slide, we're going to start walking through some of the RFP, but before we do that, I just want to pause for a minute and ask if there are any questions on what we've already covered.
I have a question.
Okay, very good then. We will keep moving forward. So on the next set of slides, you'll see that at the bottom of each one, there's a reference to the RFP page number. So we're starting off here with page 1 and looking at the intent really behind this funding stream. And the Youth Reinvestment Grant is intended to fund diversion programs that are trauma-informed, that are evidence-based, culturally relevant, and developmentally appropriate. And of course, we're also looking at getting this funding into communities that lack services, that have high rates of juvenile arrest and high rates of racial and ethnic disproportionality. Looking at a couple of due dates on these next couple slides, the first one that we're going to talk about is our letters of intent. So by by February 21st, which is 1 week from today, we are asking for anyone who intends to apply for these funds to please submit a letter to us indicating that intent. This does not have to be complicated. An email will suffice for this. And I also want to note that this is completely non-binding. Okay, so if somebody submits a letter of intent and later decides that they're really not going to move forward with the application, there is no penalty whatsoever. And similarly, we will, of course, accept applications from those who did not have a chance to submit the letter of intent. But I do want to really impress upon you that it is so helpful for us as staff to receive these letters of intent, as it really helps us gauge the workload and be able to plan not only from the staff perspective what's going to happen next and how to manage that, but for our ESC members who are not BSCC employees. These are all outside people, to really be able to prepare the training for them and the process for them and prepare for what that's going to look like. So even if you aren't able to make the February 21st date, I would rather receive a letter late than not receive it at all. Okay, and then the next due date, of course, is the proposal due date. And these proposals are due by 5 p.m. on March 29th, 2019. And we need two things from you for this grant. The first is an original signed hard copy proposal packet that will be sent in the mail to us. And the second is an electronic copy of that signed proposal packet. So we do have an option that can be used and that allows for only one of these two options to be met by 5 p.m. on March 29th. So if you do, in fact, only get in one or the other of these, either the hard copy or the electronic copy, by 5 p.m. on the 29th, then the other one would need to follow by a few days. So we do need to have both pieces in hand, but for that hard 5 p.m. deadline on the 29th, it can be one or the other. And when you do send in your electronic copies, just want to make sure everybody has this email address. It should be sent to Youth Reinvestment Grant at bscc.ca.gov. A couple more notes on the hard copy that we're asking you to send in. I would ask that everyone just print that document out and get your signatures and use one binder clip on those before you drop them in the mail to us. I specifically want to discourage the use of binders or spiral binding or anything like that. I know it looks nice, but it really just makes our job in processing them more difficult. Okay. So then looking at the purpose of the YRG funding, the primary goal, of course, is to avoid the initial contact with law enforcement, but we do have a secondary goal here, and that is to avoid further or deeper involvement in the juvenile justice system. And the statute does specifically allow for diversion interventions that are funded through this grant to incorporate educational services, including academic and vocational services, to include mentoring services, or behavioral or mental health services. The diversion services that are funded out of this grant program are intended to serve youth who are under the age of 18 or who are 18 or over with continuing juvenile court jurisdiction. The applicants for this grant must demonstrate a clear referral plan and process and must ensure participant confidentiality. Applicants must also show a commitment to avoid net widening. And in case anybody's unfamiliar with that term, what we're looking at there is just ensuring that only appropriate participants are provided these diversion services. So if you have a case where a youth could have actually been handled at a lower level or with a less restrictive approach, we would want that to occur. Okay, so looking one more time at the eligible applicants for this grant. Again, California cities and counties are the only eligible applicants, but they will be responsible for identifying a lead public agency. That could be any public agency or department, and that lead public agency will receive 10% of the grant award, and they will be responsible for coordinating the local implementation efforts as well as for data collection and management. And then the applicants, the cities and counties, are also responsible for ensuring that non-governmental organizations are identified who can actually deliver the diversion services to minors. So the NGOs will receive a total of 90% of the grant award and be responsible for providing services to minors. When we talk about the non-governmental organizations who will be partners in this grant program, it's important for everyone to be aware that the BSCC does have certain criteria for the NGOs to be able to receive funding through our grants, either directly or, as in this case, indirectly. So NGOs must be duly organized, in existence, and in good standing for at least 6 months. They must be registered with the California Secretary of State's office, if applicable. They must have a valid business license if one is required by the local jurisdiction, as well as having any other licenses or certifications necessary to be able to provide the services that are requested. And finally, they must have a physical address. Looking at the funding for this grant, the projects that are selected for funding will run for a total of 3 years and 8 months, and we're anticipating that to begin on July 1st of this year. There's a total statewide of $35,062,000 that's available for this grant. And for any given applicant, the minimum amount that they may request is $50,000, while the maximum is $1 million. The ESC talked about how this funding would roll out across our large state of California, and they were concerned with achieving geographic equity. of getting this funding out across California and not only into a few communities. So they chose to establish 4 distinct funding categories in order to facilitate that. And I'm going to explain that right now. So what we have is we're going to have one category that's for small counties and the cities within those counties, and they will be competing only with the other small counties for 20% of these grant funds. Then we'll also have another 20% of the grant funds for medium counties and the cities within those counties to compete with one another. And we'll have large counties and the cities within those large counties competing with other large counties for 20% of the grant funds. So with those small, medium, and large county breakouts, we're accounting for 60% of the total funding that's available. And then what will happen from there is we'll take the ranked list of proposals overall, and we'll use that remaining 40% to fund the highest rated proposals that weren't already identified for funding as a small, medium, or large county or city within those counties. Okay, so just a few other notes on the funding component. Applicants are able to submit multiple applications. The limitation there is that each one needs to have a different lead public agency and needs to present a unique proposal. It is also possible for applicants to submit regional applications where they are partnering with one or more other jurisdictions. This grant has a 25% match that's identified in statute. However, the statute also identifies an exception for those communities that have a high need combined with little or no existing diversion infrastructure. In that case, we have provided a place on our applicant information form where applicants can inform us that they do indeed have a high need combined with little infrastructure and are eligible and requesting the 10% match. On this grant, as with all of our competitive grants, supplanting of funds is never allowed. And actually, I'm going to pause there. We've covered quite a bit of information, so I'd like to ask if there are any questions at this time. No? Okay.
Let me copy this last one, or last few. Hang on.
Where and when will you announce which city or county applied?
We will be, as we receive letters of intent, we will be posting those on our website.
I have a question. Who selects the NGOs? Is it the county or the lead agency?
The applicant, which is the city or county, is ultimately responsible for this application and this program. So they may do that, but it's also possible for them to work with the lead public agency to do that.
Does the city or county need to submit the LOI, or can the lead agency submit the LOI on behalf of the city and county, knowing the application will be submitted by the city or county?
To the extent that that there's already an established relationship there and the city or county has agreed to move forward with the application, I think it's fine for the lead agency to submit the letter of intent.
Funds, including staff salary.
I think with that question, I would like to have the opportunity to talk about that with our team And we will post that one on our FAQs as soon as we have an answer.
Please clarify. Please clarify. An electronic copy will suffice for the deadline submission by 3/29, and the hard copy can arrive via mail soon after?
That is correct.
Can you give us an example or examples of a lead public agency?
That could be a county probation department. It could be a county mental health office.
Do school districts and county office of education qualify as lead agencies?
Well, there's another fine example. Yes, they can.
Please clarify, 50,000 or 1 million a year for 3 years or in total for 3 years?
In total for 3 years. So the budget that you lay out in your application will request somewhere between $50,000 and $1 million, but then you're going to show us in the budget pages how you will spend those funds over the entire 3-year and 8-month period.
How do you define small, medium, and large counties?
We use the demographic information published by the Department of Finance for that, and it's included in the RFP package as Appendix B on page 31.
Can one lead agency be designated for 3 proposals meeting different criteria and different regions within the county?
So that sounds to me like we're talking about one applicant using the same lead agency 3 times, but perhaps for a different proposal. And I'm going to, with that one, also want to be able to talk to my team a little bit more about that, and we will post that answer on our FAQs as soon as we have it.
Can one lead agency be designated for 3 proposals? Is this the same? I'm sorry, that's the same question. What is supplanting?
Supplanting is using the grant funds to fund something that you were already doing. So if you already had a funded position, actually, Helene, would you mind explaining this? You are the master.
Hi all. So supplanting can get a little tricky, but in general, it's money that you're using for a particular action or activity that is new because of the award of the grant. So as an example, if in your agency you had a budget as of July 1 and you had a social worker who was working with a group of kids, and then you got this grant, you could not now use that grant money for that social worker salary unless that individual is now doing something different above and beyond that they wouldn't normally have done for the grant, because you now have the grant. So you cannot realize a savings because you've been awarded this money. And if you do have something that's detailed, you can always send it to the email box that Kim mentioned so that we can take a look at it on an individual basis, because it does get a little tricky, but that's the general rule of supplanting.
Thank you so much.
There's more.
Okay.
Can the lead agency submit a proposal without yet naming the CBOs it will partner with?
Yes, that is acceptable. However, I do want to mention that it's important that the proposal clearly lay out the work that will be done under this grant. So you may wait until later to identify the specific partners. However, it's critical that you identify the work that will be done in your proposal so that when it's read and rated by the ESC members, they can clearly see what's going to be done in the community as a part of your proposal.
Can match come in the form of in-kind contributions?
Yes.
Can you please clarify youth eligibility for 18 and over?
So the primary target group for this grant are under 18 youth. However, the ESC did feel that it was important to open that up a little bit and allow for a youth who may have turned 18 but is continuing to be under juvenile court jurisdiction to be allowed to participate in this program.
Who is responsible for the match?
That was much like the question that came up earlier, and we'll address that more fully in our FAQs.
Please give some concrete examples of how the in-kind match could be met by both the lead agency and CBOs.
I'm sorry, can you read that again?
Please give some concrete examples of how the in-kind match could be met by both the lead agency and CBO.
Oh, okay. Could I maybe get your help again on this one, Helene?
Okay, sorry, trying to go back and forth.
I know, you're doing a lot, thank you.
So the in-kind match by a CBO would be if they have someone volunteering and there's no salary that's associated with it. You can do volunteer time. You can put up a position for the project that is not being paid by the grant funds. A site or a location that you're going to be holding services at are already being paid for by someone else, but you're using that as a kind of a donation of space. So those are all the kinds of things that either the agency or the CBO are, I call it, ponying up without any benefit of the grant funds of receiving reimbursement for those.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Please clarify if the resolution needs to be submitted with the proposal or once awarded.
If you have it ready to go, it's great to send it in with the application, but it can be submitted later.
Does the match have to come from the applicant, or can it be matched by NGO or lead agency?
Okay, so once again, we'll address that in the FAQs.
Will BSCC be identifying the counties ranging of small, medium, and large?
Yes, in fact, that's included in the RFP package as Appendix B, which is on page 31.
What is meant and what are the ramifications for the size of awards for regional applications versus an individual application?
So,
did you catch it?
I think so.
Okay.
So a regional application would be an application that includes more than one local jurisdiction. And the legislation specifically addresses this and provides that in that case, the total amount that can be requested is additive. So if you've got two jurisdictions who are partnering together to submit a regional application, the maximum amount that could be requested is $2 million. If you have four, the maximum's $4 million. So it does add up based on the number of jurisdictions who are partnering for the regional application.
Page 3, last sentence says, service providers are expected to accept calls from anyone who would otherwise call law enforcement. Please clarify, this is the screen for eligibility based on the program model and referral pathways, and not as an expectation to serve whoever is referred.
The intent there is that we want to, again, thinking about what we talked about a few minutes ago as the primary goal for this grant, and that is to avoid initial contact with law enforcement. So the idea with that statement in the RFP is to ensure that referrals can be made by anyone who, in the absence of that diversion program, would otherwise be contacting law enforcement.
Will more than one proposal be funded for the same region as long as proposals are distinctly different?
Well, that's ultimately going to depend on the rating of each proposal. So again, we're looking at 20% of funding going to small counties and the cities within those, 20% to medium, 20% to large. So some of those could regionally be in the same area. What was the last part of that? As long as they're distinctly different. So maybe the question is also about proposals coming from the same organization. I'm not sure. Hopefully I answered that. If not, perhaps the questioner can clarify. Yes, by all means.
So it's clear to me what you're saying, the small, medium, and large counties and the competition within those 20-20-20. But I don't really understand the other 40%. Who would qualify? You said a ranking of proposals, but I don't understand. It seems like everybody would fall within the small, medium, and large. Who falls into that other 40% category?
Okay. So what we'll do, when the ESC has read and rated all the proposals, there'll be one long list of all the applications in rank order. So depending on the score that the ESC assigns to each application, there's going to be one that has the highest score and there's going to be one that has the lowest score, right? And everybody else falls down the line. So the first thing that we're going to do is look at the small, medium, and large and pull out the top 20% from that master list. But then there's going to be a lot of people left on that list, right? So then we go back to the top and see which proposals haven't already been funded as a small, medium, or large, and we'll fund from the top down until we reach the 40% amount. Okay, so for the smalls, for the mediums, for the larges, there's about 7 million each. So it's entirely possible that we'll have more than 7 large counties apply for funding, or 7 small counties apply for funding. So each of the smalls may not be able to get funded in that small category because there may not be enough money to get that far, but maybe they are a higher rated proposal to where when we look at that remaining 40% and spending that down, we reach them. Does that help? Yes. Okay, good. Any more questions? Okay.
You have a few more. Okay. Follow-up question, supplanting. In the social worker example she provided, would it be considered supplanting if the CBO increased the number of youth served by receiving the grant funding without doing new activities?
So that's one of those situations where we'd have to look at how say the social worker is being funded. Because if you are just doing a group and you had 6 individuals in the group and now you have 10, and that's a ratio that is something that you would be doing anyway up to the max, then no, because just like us, it doesn't matter if there's 5 people in the room or 500 online, we're still doing the exact same thing. Now, if there is a new curriculum that the social worker will be providing and that's different, then part of her salary could be paid for by the grant because she wasn't doing, say, motivational interviewing before the grant. So that curriculum, her time doing that with those individuals would not be supplanting. But if you're just doing the same curriculum with 5 kids or up to 10, her salary would be remaining the same because she's still providing services. Now, if there was some one-on-one counseling, then those increased youth and those one-on-one times could be used for the grant for those activities. Does that make sense? So if it's very specific, like I said, please let us know in an email and we can look at the specificity of it, because it does get a little convoluted and complicated depending on, especially with NGOs who have multiple funding streams, and you'll have like a 0.3, a 0.5, and a 0.2 all paying one single person. So it gets a little complicated, but hopefully that's a good general answer.
Great,
For now.
thank you.
Does the in-kind match have to come from the lead agency, or can it be from multiple agencies in the same county?
Which one did you take? This was. Okay.
From multiple agencies in the same county. That would be fine for it to come from multiple agencies within the county.
How would we calculate the site or location match, like the rental costs?
It's actually built into our budget template, so it'll calculate it for you.
Not necessarily if it's match on the outside. I think
thought it did.
I think what I'm assuming the question is like if we had this room and it was only being used for an hour for services, but we were paying for it 24/7, how would you calculate that? And the methodology that would be fairly standard is you would find out how much it costs for the square footage, and then divide it by the amount of time that you're using it for your program that wasn't being used before, and then use that as your methodology for not reimbursement, but for ponying up that grant contribution, match contribution. That's how I took it.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Anything else?
Do the in-kind donations have to come directly from the lead county if it is a county applying, or can they be from multiple departments?
So I think that's asking about does the county itself have to make the match, or could it be the lead public agency? And it could be the lead public agency or other agencies within the county.
So for instance, the CBO uses its programming space to serve youth but does not include space in its budget. That would be considered an acceptable match. I'm sorry, this related to that previous question, how to calculate match, like the rental costs.
And yes, that is acceptable. Okay, great. So then let's keep moving forward here. And we are now at page 7 in the RFP and looking at some evaluation requirements. With this grant, we are going to be having a statewide evaluator. That entity has yet to be identified, but we're working on that, and there will be someone as directed by the statute who is retained for that purpose. So each grantee will be responsible for coordinating with our statewide evaluator who's identified. But in addition to that, there's some local requirements that are in play here. And what we ask for of every grantee is 2 separate things. One, the local evaluation plan, and that comes in the beginning of the process, shortly after we put together the grant agreement. We'll start talking to you about preparing this local evaluation plan. And in the plan, you'll need to identify your goals and objectives, and also tell us about how you're going to assess the effectiveness of your interventions that you use. Then, once the service period has ended, we'll be looking for a local evaluation report from each grantee. And in that report, you'll be asked to describe the overall project success in meeting the goals that were identified up front. Okay, so then starting on page 12 and continuing through page 17 or so, over the next couple slides here, we're going to talk about some additional requirements that are in place for this grant. And I'll go through the list fairly quickly here, but I do want to encourage everybody to take time to read these so that you have a good understanding of all the requirements for participating in this grant program. So at the top of the list, we see grant agreement. And each applicant who's selected to receive funding under this grant will be entering into a grant agreement with the BSCC. That's a legal and binding document. And you will also be required to submit your governing board resolution. There are audit requirements tied to this grant, and you'll be required to maintain all your records and reports related to this grant and be subject to audits for up to 3 years following conclusion of the grant. We'll be holding a grantee orientation for all those who are selected to receive funding in order to provide specific information about grant implementation. The funding disbursement for this grant allows for advance payment. So after grantees are under agreement with us, they will be eligible to receive 1/3 of the grant award amount. And then once 80% of that first 1/3 is spent down, they'll be able to receive another 1/3. And when 80% of that is spent down, they'll be able to receive the final 1/3. There's some quarterly reporting required with this grant, and for that, the vehicle that we use is our quarterly progress reports. There's a sample that's provided in your package, but that is a sample. We'll be working on specifically tailoring that to this grant, and the final would be made available as part of the grantee orientation. All right, moving on, there is travel allowed under this grant, and travel can be charged to this grant as long as the requirements and guidelines that are laid out in the RFP are followed. The next item there, the BSCC has a responsibility to ensure fiscal integrity for the grant funds that we administer, and so we do not enter into grant agreement with an applicant who has been subject to debarment or who has been convicted of fraud, theft, or embezzlement within the last 3 years. We use comprehensive monitoring visits to ensure the ongoing success of our grantees, and that's something that comes during the implementation phase of your grant. There's a sample provided for the monitoring tool that we use as part of your RFP packet. The BSCC highly encourages all applicants to use effective programs and data-driven approaches. We've provided some detailed information about that in the RFP, as well as a resource list at the back of the RFP that can be used to help guide you to those programs and practices that have been demonstrated to be the most effective. The BSCC is also concerned with reducing racial and ethnic disparities and encourages each applicant to consider how the proposal that you're presenting will impact the racial and ethnic disparities that may exist in your community. Okay, with that slide, let's go ahead and pause for a minute and we will take questions again. Oh, look at that. Yeah, come on up.
So regarding all of the requirements, will BSCC be interacting directly with the NGOs on those requirements, or only with the applicant, and then it's the applicant's responsibility to assure that the NGOs are following?
Given that each applicant will be required to designate a lead public agency, I envision that entity to be our primary point of contact.
So, for example, if one of the requirements is audit reporting, would that be only the city or county audit, or would it be the NGOs that would be have to show their audits?
It would include all of the records and reports that fall under the umbrella of this grant. So anything that's part of the work that's done for this grant would be subject to the audit. So if we were looking at scheduling an audit, of course we would coordinate with all the applicable parties to make sure that everybody's there, and we would have all the materials that would be needed.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else in the room have a question? Okay, let's turn to the callers then.
Is the CBO community-based organization different from the NGO non-government organization? And what would a nonprofit organization be classified as? Would it be CBO or NGO?
That's a great question. I'm glad somebody brought it up. The legislation for this grant specifically talks about the partners as being community-based organizations. At the BSCC, we use the more broad general term of non-governmental organization. So it is, for all intents and purposes, we're using them interchangeably here. But you'll see in the RFP, and in, I think now all of our documentation, we do use NGO, but it's one and the same.
If a county is applying for a project for its own probation department, could the county apply for a second project with the County Office of Education and the local Workforce Development Board?
Most definitely.
What is the expectation of continuation or institutionalization of the program beyond the grant period?
I could take that in one of two ways. One being whether or not there will be continuing funding through our office, and at this point there is not. This is one-time funding that was provided in the budget, and we have a certain amount of time to spend it, but at this point there's no additional funding beyond that period. In terms of grantee sustainability, there is nothing that specifically speaks to that or requires that in either the statute or the RFP. Of course, we always like to see that our funds are going to good use, and hopefully there are programs put in place with this that are effective and can be sustained over time, but there's not a requirement around that.
If the primary goal is to avoid initial contact with law enforcement, then how are youth identified or referred to CBO?
So within each application, one of the things that I mentioned early on as one of the requirements is that the applicants will need to clearly define and describe their referral process. So that is something that's incumbent upon each applicant, is to define and describe what that referral process will look like.
We may have heard incorrectly. Did you say that if applying as a regional application, then the application can apply for more than 1 million?
Yes, that is correct. The statute in this case specifically allows for regional applications to be submitted and to be eligible for the aggregate amount that all of those jurisdictions could have received individually.
Are requirements, slide 19, for the lead agency or city or county applicant?
Ultimately, it is the city or county applicant who's responsible, but I would envision that it's primarily going to be the lead public agency who's doing the administration of this grant, and would be, on a day-to-day basis at least, concerned with those requirements and involved with looking at them and ensuring them. For each city or county applicant, they'll need to determine how they will go about selecting the partners that they'll use under this grant. So we're not dictating that. That's up to each individual applicant.
What constitutes as acceptable educational programming for diversion services?
What the statute says is that it can include academic or vocational education. There's no parameters on it beyond that. So again, I would say that it's up to the applicant to describe what the local need is and also to clearly describe the proposed program to address that need.
Are there any guidelines or requirements about the process used by the lead agency to select CPO partners?
Not at the statewide level. Okay, very good. So let's move forward then. We are ready to start talking about the proposal rating process. And this, I meant to mention a minute ago, and some of you may have noticed if you're following along in your RFPs, we skipped a few pages a while back, and now we're going back to page 9. And once we have all the proposals in-house, okay, so come March 30th, what's going to happen is the next thing is for the BSCC staff to go through a technical compliance review. So we'll be looking at all of these proposals, and we'll be looking for minor non-substantive errors that could easily be corrected. So things like a missed signature on one of the documents, or maybe a wrong number of pages for a given section, or a narrative budget figure doesn't tie to what's actually in the budget table, things like that. For those minor non-substantive changes, we typically allow a very short period of time for an applicant to correct those and be able to have their application continue on through the reading and rating process. There are a couple of instances where there's automatic disqualification of an application, and those instances are one, if the application is submitted by an entity other than a city or county, and two, if the application is received after the 5 p.m. due date on March 29th. In either of those cases, if an application is disqualified, or if there are minor technical issues that could be corrected, we'll be reaching out and providing notification to the applicant about that, as well as any parameters for making minor changes. And then from here, we're ready to look a little bit more closely, specifically at the ESC rating process that is used. And for that, I'm going to ask Tony Jackson to take over.
So once we get to this point in the process, what we do is we collect all the applications that have been approved through the technical compliance review, and we schedule a meeting with the ESC, and in that meeting we call that the rater training. So we bring the ESC back in and we go over how to proposals. We cover the rating factors, so bring them up to date so that we have all the same understanding of the rating factors. And then we also go over the scoring portion. And then we also go over the scoring portion. Next slide. On the next slide, this is our rating factor table. The rating factor table can be found on pages 11 and 12 of the proposal. If you'd like to see the rating factors in full detail, the rating factors are listed on pages 19 through 26. So in the proposal, what this table tells you, it tells you three different things. It lists out the primary rating factors. They are the program need, the program description, data collection and evaluation, and the program budget. The second thing that this table tells you is which one of these rating factors the ESC thought was the most important, or how they weighted them. So if you look at item 2, project description was weighted 50% of the total value. So as far as ESC is concerned, that's the most important part of your proposal. The next item is program need. That was given 35% weight. The next one was the program budget. That was given a 10% weight. And then the data collection and evaluation was given 5% weight. And why we say that's important, that also gives you an idea on how and where to spend your time writing your proposal. And the other thing that we ask is when you're writing your proposal, we ask that you really read the rating factors and all the criteria on the rating factors. And if you have any questions, submit those questions in to Kim, and we'll get together as a team and go over and try to prepare an answer. And if someone does submit those questions in, those questions will also be listed on the Q&A, so everyone that may be applying or may be interested will see those questions as well. So are there any questions on the rating factor or the rating factor table or the weights? No? Another thing that the ESC thought was important, they didn't want to fund proposals that weren't worthy of receiving funding, so they came up with a funding threshold. That funding threshold is 60% of the 100% of the total score. So in other words, that would be every proposal to be considered for funding must score at least 180 points. So the next slide is an example of the scoring rubric, and our scoring rubric only has five scores. So you either get a poor rating factor, which is a 1, a fair, which is a 2, satisfactory, which is a 3, a good, which is a 4, or an excellent, which is a 5. And the way that looks, that kind of looks like a report card. So your overall score will fall in either an A, which is excellent, B, good, C, satisfactory, D, fair, or F, poor. And then what we do during the rater training, we bring the raters in. And when we get to this point in the rater training, we sit down with the raters and we go over each one of these categories to make sure or to ensure that the raters are on the same page as how they defined it and how they assign the points. And that table could be found on page 12 of the RFP. Are there any questions about the scoring rubric? And the ESC also thought it was important to assign preference points. The way they assigned their preference points was for services for Indian children, and any application that comes in with services for Indian children that are defined as applicants must identify the target population and provide an estimate number of Indian children that will be served. In addition to that, they must describe the services that will be provided to those children. And they also must identify the NGO partner and provide a letter of commitment. So all three of those must be a part of this application to receive the 10 points. And if those are part of the application, those 10 points are given to the proposal regardless of the scoring of the rating factors. And then those 10 points are added at the end of the points to come up with the total points. Are there any questions?
Okay, great. Okay, I'll pause in just a minute. Okay, so with this next slide, this talks about information that's included in the RFP on pages 18 through 27. But with this one slide, I was really just trying to give you sort of a snapshot of what your overall proposal package is going to look like, and specifically information about the page limits that are in place for some of the different proposal components. So the first thing we have is the proposal abstract, which is limited to 1 page. And then we have the proposal narrative, which you have 10 pages for, but that has to include your program need, your program description, and your plan for data collection. The other piece that's identified here as part of the proposal narrative is the work plan. And that is, in fact, a required component, but we have a specific template that's included in your RFP for that. And that work plan template. You can use 1 to 2 pages to lay out your goals and objectives in that work plan. And however long it is, whether it's 1 page or 2 pages, that does not count towards your 2 pages for the proposal narrative. The next component is your program budget. That's a separate Excel document. So there will be 2 documents that you submit to us when you send this in. One will be a Word document that has all the narrative, and then the other will be the Excel document that contains the budget narrative and tables. All right, the final component there is the additional documents that are allowed for this grant. And the ESC identified a possibility of up to 10 pages for this. So that could include any letters of some support and commitment that would be submitted as part of your proposal. As was just discussed, if you are looking to receive the preference points by providing services to Indian children, then you will need to have at least 1 letter in there as an additional document. The additional documents could also include things like charts and graphs that may be in support of some of the information that's provided in your proposal narrative. And I do want to point out that in your narrative, it's critical that you not rely on links. So when you're talking about your need or how you're going to address your need, please don't refer the reader to an outside source for information. Our ESC members will read and rate the information that's in front of them, but they will not be able to go outside of that to access anything. So if there's something that you want to include, like I said, maybe a chart or graph or some endnotes, you can add those into your additional documents. And so with that, let's go ahead and pause there. We'll take any questions up to this point. I don't see any in the room, but I think we have some on the line.
Have the data points or types of data that the appointed evaluator will be collecting from all grantees already been identified?
They have not.
I asked earlier examples of a LPA, lead public agency, and I was given county probation office as an example. Does the RFP instructions define other examples, or can you give me a couple of more options of LPA?
The RFP doesn't specifically provide examples. It's open to any public agency or department. So it could be, any city department or agency, as well as any county department or agency.
Please define region, same as county?
I'm guessing that that's in regards to the regional applications. And in that case, regional just means more than one jurisdiction. So it would not necessarily have to be multiple jurisdictions, like multiple cities within a county. It could be 2 counties, it could be 1 county and 1 city, any combination of multiple local jurisdictions.
What is it meant by 25% match or 10% match? Please clarify.
Okay, so in general, this grant requires a 25% match, which at either level, either the 25 or the 10% level, the match can be either cash or in kind. But the 25% is the basic match that's required for this grant. However, there's an exception that's provided for that is intended to assist any jurisdiction that is experiencing a high need coupled with a low or no existing diversion infrastructure. So in those cases where a city or a county may be experiencing a very high need for diversion services, but currently has very little or even no existing diversion services, then they can indicate on our application information form that they're eligible to only submit a 10% match.
You mentioned an implementation phase. Is there a general expectation for certain phases of the project in the grant period or time frame?
There aren't specific phases laid out, but we do recognize in the work that we do that it can take a little while to get up and running. And so we don't go out to do a monitoring visit for a program that is still trying to hire staff and bring services online.
Do regions need to be geographically contiguous?
No, they do not.
Just to confirm, the budget Excel sheet is not included in the program narrative, 10 pages.
That is correct. Okay, great. So, oh yeah, a couple questions in the room. Come on up.
So regarding data collection and outside evaluator,
Yes.
if the proposal is very clear and accepted in terms of what data collection would be, can an outside evaluator impose additional data collection or additional work that may not have been budgeted for?
We're very sensitive to that and have talked about that at length, and will ensure that that's not an issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Okay. A couple more online, it looks like.
Is specific documentation needed to meet the regional application requirements? Example, letter of support or board resolution?
I'm drawing a blank on that. So let us handle that through the FAQs. I thought there was a piece in the RFP that addressed that. So I apologize, but we will look at that, and I will get that posted on our FAQs as soon as possible.
The applicant can only be a city or county entity. So how do they apply without having the information of or already have a CPO or NGO program in mind to include in the application? It appears that the application must partner with an LPA and an existing program with youth diversion goals. So my question is, how does the applicant reach out to potential programs to partner with to obtain program narrative information? Our organization is DRAGG, Drag Racing Against Gangs and Graffiti. As an NGO or CPO, do we reach out to our county or city to apply and consider us as partnering NGO or CPO?
I think it's a great idea. If you're an NGO and you have an interest in this program, we certainly encourage you to reach out to the local jurisdictions that you work with or in, and approach them about partnering on this grant. It is true that the applicant has to be the city or county, but again, when you think about the fact that 90% of the funding is actually going to the NGOs, they're critical partners. So it's, I think it would be much easier for an applicant to present a really detailed application if they do already have the NGOs in mind to use, but it's not required as long as they can lay out the work that they're planning to do.
Since evaluation is required, where does evaluation show up in the budget? Can an evaluator count as a CPO cost, or is it part of the 10% lead budget?
If you're using a CBO to do the evaluation work, then it could be on that CBO line. Otherwise, we would expect to see that associated with the lead public agency.
You mentioned diversion services are intended for youth under 18 or 18 and over with continuing juvenile court jurisdiction. By that, are you looking at only serving youth who have had an actual arrest record?
No. Again, the primary goal here is to avoid the initial contact with law enforcement. However, the ESC did want to ensure that for those who have had contact and may be able to benefit from diversion services in terms of mitigating further involvement in the system, that would be an option. Okay. Any other questions in the room? Okay. So we're going to turn it over to Isabel now, and she's going to walk us through the budget, since the budget is a little bit more involved than some of the other pieces and can sometimes cause confusion or challenges for people. We wanted to make sure we provided some solid examples there and take you through it.
Okay, thank you, Kim. I'll review the budget attachment, which includes both your budget table and your budget narrative. This can be accessed within an Excel document. So if you reference page 26 of your RFP, you have a link that will take you to the Excel document. For this process, we'll go over the handout that you guys picked up next to the sign-in sheet, labeled example. And for those online, it should be downloadable and labeled handout. So going to the handout, I'd just like to note that this is an example. It's just so that we can get familiar with how to enter information. It is not a complete budget. Your budget should follow your program requirements. Within the template, you'll see red text, and this is the information that the applicant is required to provide. So let's start off with the name of California county or city. This is where you would enter your city or county name. Moving down, you see year one program budget. Underneath there, you'll see a budget line item. This is a blue table. These are the line items that you are limited to for your program. And if we move over to the right, you see a match, grant funds, and total column. These areas auto-populate based on information you'll be providing. And going down, you'll see required match, the 10% and 25% match that Kim talked about. This template does auto-populate that total as well. Moving down to number 1, salary and benefits budget table. I provide an example, Bob Smith, the fiscal manager. We listed his hourly rate and total hours, and we got a total of $8,784. Please note that my example is only in whole dollars, and we ask that you guys do the same. Please do not provide decimals. Moving to salaries and benefits narrative section. I didn't go into detail on this example, but I did list some direction. So you would state the fiscal manager and then provide a narrative description stating how the request will serve to meet the stated goals and objectives for the project. So before we go to page 2, I just want to remind you guys that the budget line item, that blue box on page 1, this auto-populates based on the information we're going over. Going to page 2, number 2. Services and supplies. I provide an example for printing services. I entered my calculation and got a total of $1,500. Moving to the bottom of the number 2, still services and supplies table, you see that $1,500 claim auto-populates. Again, you would provide a narrative. Going to number 3, professional services. You are not required to claim funding out of every budget line item, but we do ask that you identify this by entering an NA and a $0 claim. Going to page 3. Non-governmental organizations. I provide an example for mentoring services for youth. Again, enter your total, it auto-populates. You provide a narrative. If we go to number 5, equipment and fixed assets. I provided 2 examples, a laptop and a printer. I did this so I could explain how you would start a new paragraph within a narrative section. So if we move to this narrative section, you notice I have laptop, and underneath it reads, to start a new paragraph, hold down the alternate key and press enter. Moving to page 4. Number 6, data collection, and number 7, project evaluation. This process is similar to the ones we just went over. You would again just enter your claim, your dollar amount, and your narrative. If you guys would like, you can reference the examples. However, we'll go to page 5. Number 8, other. So this line item is where you would claim your travel, your training, or any other claims that don't fit in the other line items. Moving to number 9, indirect costs. You have 2 options. Option 1, 10% of total direct salaries and wages, or option 2, 5% of direct total project costs. The template auto-populates those totals, but you're still required to identify. As you can see, I went with a total of 1,621, option 2. So before I hand it over to Kim to go over indirect costs, just a couple reminders. Please access the RFP and the budget template online to ensure you have the updated copy. And everything that I just went over is available in the Excel document on the instructions tab. Any questions?
Can you come up to the podium, please? Thank you.
What is an example of an indirect cost?
But like a manager that oversees not working.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Oh. Okay, so the question was asking for an example of an indirect cost, and I provided the example of a manager who oversees a program who isn't working directly on the program, but who oversees the staff who are working directly on it. So, okay. Oh, okay, and one more question.
Did you say the first table auto-populates based on other tables? So I believe they're referring to the budget line item table, which is the blue table on page 1. This does auto-populate based on the tables that we reviewed later within the template. Yeah, everything we entered in pages 2 through 5 all auto-populates on page 1 at the very top table.
So if you have the handout, it's easy to see that it's blue. So everything that's in blue, you won't be getting into, and those are the fields that are auto-populating.
Can we go back to the direct indirect cost limitations page?
They want. Were we here? We are going to talk about we're going to talk about the indirect costs a little bit more. You already covered the reminders. Okay, great. So hopefully, rather than pulling that document back up again, this will suffice for the question coming from the live stream individual. So for indirect costs with this grant, applicants have 2 options here. The first is you can use 10% of your direct salaries and wages amount for indirect costs, and with that it could either include or exclude the benefits, but 10% of direct salaries and wages. And then the other option is to use 5% of your total project costs, excluding equipment. Okay, so either of those calculations are acceptable to us for this grant. And as Isabel just showed us on her example, the budget template is going to calculate the 5 and 10% for you automatically. So you'll be able to see what those are. Are there any questions on that? Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank
Hi.
you. So for the indirect cost rate, since 90% is passed through dollars, how does that apply to the subcontractors? Do they separately fill out forms or for the total contract?
It's for the total contract.
Okay, so then subcontractors might have their own indirect following these same guidelines, or no?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so for example, if the lead county applies, then they would fill out this indirect, but 90% is passed through, so then typically counties contract with community-based organizations that also have indirect requirements per county or city. So how does that work?
So you're asking what indirect cost rate might the city or county use when they're looking at selecting their NGOs?
That's right, because then they also have an indirect rate with their subcontract.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
So the answer that we're going to provide to you is right now this section of our grant admin guide is being re-looked at, and if you go to it right now, I believe there's a filler or a placeholder that says right now we're looking at this. Currently, this is the scenario for all subcontractors, but as we work through it, we'll be providing an update in the grant admin guide, which will also go into the FAQs if we're able to do something different, but this is definitely an urgent matter that we're working on currently, given that we have about 5 requests for proposals out that would need to look at this.
So currently how I described it, it's still okay?
What you could do is have 2 different, because I can't tell you whether or not we'll be able to expand so that the CBOs will be able to allow their own vetted indirect cost rate. And it's kind of a push and pull, because we also don't overstep our contracting. We don't oversee or administer any contracting policies that the local county or department would have. So I know that's ambiguous and circular, and it's kind of meant to be right now. But we will definitely make sure that that's in the FAQs that we continually update through the solicitation. So right now, this would have to go down to your CBOs.
Okay, so then you're saying that municipalities that contract out would have to also make sure that their subcontracts don't exceed
Correct.
this. Okay,
Currently.
got it. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other questions on this piece?
So the salaries and benefits of the CBO staff is not listed separately on the budget sheet. The salaries and benefits reflect only the LPA staffing. Yes, that is correct.
Okay, great. So moving right along then, we're going to just go through fairly quickly the appendices that are included. And I'm not going to talk at length about these, but I do want to make sure that everybody has a good feel for the information that's included in the RFP, and especially those pieces where you're going to be required to pull something out and sign it and submit it as part of your proposal. So looking first at Appendix A, you see that I have put that in red. It's in red because that is one of the things where you are going to have to use that document as part of your proposal package. It requires a signature, and it's required to be submitted with your proposal. And that speaks to the criteria that we went over earlier about NGOs. So then Appendix B, that is the county population that we used in determining the breakout for small, medium, and large counties. Appendix C is a glossary of terms, and I really want to encourage everybody to take a look at that. There are terms that are defined specific to this grant included in there, and I think you will find that helpful. Appendix D talks about the local evaluation plan and provides some additional guidance on that. Appendix E contains the roster of the Executive Steering Committee members. Appendix F is a sample grant agreement, and again, that is just a sample at this point in time. Once we are at the point of entering into agreements with individual grantees, it will be drawn up to meet those specifications. Appendix G is the resolution that must be submitted, and again, this is something that we would love to see it as part of the proposal package, but if you can't get the signed resolution in time for the March 29th due date, you can submit it later. Appendix H provides a sample quarterly progress report, and again, this is just a sample. It won't look exactly like this. We will be working on tailoring this document to meet the specifics of this grant, and it will be finalized once we have grantees identified. Okay, Appendix I is related to compliance with policies that we talked about a little bit earlier that relate to not entering into a contract with an applicant who has been debarred or who's been convicted of various crimes. That one, again, is in red. It needs to be signed and submitted as part of your proposal package. Appendix J provides our sample monitoring tool. So we talked about the comprehensive monitoring visits that staff conduct after the grants are in place and underway. And this is the tool that we're using currently. Appendix K provides our list of resources related to evidence-based programs and practices. And then I'm sorry, excuse me 1 minute. So if somebody has a specific question about where to find something, if you would please just ask that question, then we can address it directly. I'm not sure. Okay, so there may be some differences in the page numbers from what somebody has printed out or is looking at online compared to what we're showing here in the room today. If that's the case, I do apologize for any confusion. I do believe that what we're presenting here is the latest, and I thought it was accurate. But again, if that's not the case, I do apologize for any confusion. Okay, so then with this slide, we're talking about the information that's included in the RFP at the very end of the document. So the pages are numbered up through page 77, and then after that they're not numbered. And those final 7 or 8 pages make up the actual proposal package. So if you look at that, you'll see the first thing there is the proposal package cover sheet. We ask you to complete that and submit that as your cover sheet. And then the next item is the proposal checklist. And the checklist, to me, is one of the most helpful pages in this whole document. It's a really nice reference to be able to remember all the different pieces that are required, which pieces require a signature, and what the page limitations are in some of the different areas. And then we also have the applicant information form that's there at the back of that package. This form must be completed and submitted by each applicant. And then at the very end, we have just a summary sheet that shows what your proposal overall is going to look like, the different components, and we've got the weights there that were assigned for each component in the proposal narrative section. And then the last page, we do have the project work plan template. So that will be used to do that 1 to 2 page project work plan that becomes part of your proposal narrative. I also wanted to go over just a few key dates here. We already talked about this, but we are asking for letters of intent by next week, February 21st. And again, just encourage you to get those in, even if you can't meet that due date. But then the proposals themselves are due by 5 p.m. on March 29th, 2019. And then following that, in April and May, we'll be going through the proposal rating process as well as the development of the funding recommendations. And then it is my intent and my goal to have those funding recommendations from our executive steering committee in time for me to present their recommendation to our BSCC board at its meeting on June 13th. And if that all goes as planned, then we will be in a position to begin the new grants on July 1st of this year. And then again, as we mentioned earlier, there will be a mandatory new grantee orientation that will be held sometime either in late August or in September. Are there any more questions? Okay, I see a couple in the room and invite you to come on up to the podium.
Good morning. Aside from the grantee orientation, are there any other scheduled that you foresee grantee meetings throughout the 3-year course?
Not in person, but there would probably be some call-in meetings during the rest of the grant period.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think you said that a local education agency can apply as a lead agency?
Yes, that's correct.
And a county office of education?
Yes, they are public agencies, so they would be able to fill that role of lead public agency. Again, the applicant would be the city or county, but the school district or office of ed could be the lead public agency.
In place of the city or county?
Not in place of,
okay,
but as the lead public agency.
And is that the same for an independent charter school that operates as an LEA?
I do, if it's a public school.
So charter schools can either be independent or dependent on a local school district.
Mm-hmm.
So if a charter school operates as an independent local education agency,
mm-hmm,
can it be a lead?
You know, I am going to refrain from trying to answer that and look at it a little more carefully and make sure that we provide an accurate answer. We'll do that in our FAQs.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question. Okay, anything else in the room? Okay, no other one other question here. We'll go ahead and take that first.
So sorry, because I was taking notes when you answered the last part of her question, so I might be asking what she already just asked. I just want clarification. So if the city or county is the applicant, did you say that they can also be the lead public agency, or we have to have a lead public agency, different from the applicant?
The city or county can opt to fill that role of lead public agency on its own.
Okay.
So it's their discretion whether to assign a different agency or department or to fill that role themselves.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I don't see anything else in the room. Let's go ahead and address the callers or the online the call.
Will our questions and your answers be available in an FAQ form so we can share with our county or city partners and LPAs?
Yes, we have some FAQs up on our website already, but we will be updating them, most definitely updating them to reflect the discussion here today. And then throughout the process, up through the proposal due date, we will update them and repost them periodically.
Did you say that there could be more than one Maine county or city designated NGOs noted on the grant?
Yes, an applicant can use only one NGO if that meets the requirements of their proposal. However, it's certainly also possible for any number of NGOs to be identified as part of an applicant's overall proposal.
With the dual requirement of prevention and no net widening, how do these two aspects work?
Boy, I'm not sure I quite follow that. The requirement of prevention, I think what they're speaking to there is this idea of trying to intervene and divert kids prior to initial law enforcement contact. The other piece of that, which is about no net widening, is actually very much in line with that. And the idea there is that we always want to be handling these youth at the lowest possible level. So if there's an arrest, maybe there's still a possibility to get a youth into a diversion program. But if that arrest doesn't have to happen, then that's even better. And we want to make sure that we do the diversion at the earliest possible stage.
In putting the budget together, please confirm that 90% of the costs will be for direct services provided by NGO. So should salaries and supplies incurred by NGO go under NGO subcontracts or under the various budget line items, like salaries and benefits, services and supplies, etc.?
I would really like to answer this in our FAQs. I think, I honestly didn't think about that a whole lot until Isabel was just walking through the example, and I want to make sure that we give a good answer on this. So let us take it back and look at it a little more carefully and provide a clear, accurate answer in our FAQs.
How are durable equipment accounted for at the end of the grant period? For example, if we buy a printer that lasts 5 years, do we need to depreciate and credit back the remaining?
It's theirs. In terms of the depreciation, you would use your normal accounting process and procedures, but no, that's if it's yours at the end of that period.
Just to confirm, the LPA does not have to be an independent entity from the applicant. Can the applicant be its own LPA?
Yes.
Can there be more than one NGO on the same grant under the same county and county public agency?
Yes. Okay. So quickly, just one final reminder here. The proposals are due by 5 p.m. on March 29th, 2019. And any questions that you have should be submitted to our dedicated grant mailbox. That address is Youth Reinvestment Grant at bscc.ca.gov. As I just mentioned a minute ago, we will be responding to questions through the proposal due date, and will periodically update the posted FAQs that are on our website. So unless there are any other questions, that concludes our presentation for today. Okay.